Have you ever watched a hero so cool that you want to know absolutely everything about them? I'm talking about a hero that's firing on all cylinders in a story so great that you wish there was more. Well, how about an origin story? All I can say is be careful what you wish for. Today we're going to look at why prequels so often fail and what that means for our own writing. Before we get into that though, here's a reminder to check out dcferguson.com for all of my latest videos, overviews of my books, exclusive behind the scenes content for each of my series, and you can sign up for my newsletter. I should also mention that you can help me out in a big way if you like this video, subscribe, and share it with any friends that also enjoy the art of storytelling. Let's get a few things out of the way right off the bat. Is every prequel a failure? Absolutely not. Can we learn something today to successfully write one? We sure can. Am I going to shamelessly plug my own prequel novella to the Dragon's Dream Saga? Yes, because that's the book you get for free when you sign up for my newsletter. So what are you waiting for? Back to that in a minute though. First, we have to address some big reasons why sequels don't work, and there are many. So let's start with the first, most obvious one. Reduced stakes. This is a huge problem with a prequel. Since we already know that certain characters will be alive and well for the original story, a prequel story has fewer stakes. There's no risk to established characters because we already know their fate. With that in mind, we as writers have to solve the problem that we just created by writing a prequel. What is the conflict here? If it's just a first battle between our established hero and their antagonist, then we know it ends in a draw and does nothing to add to our hero's legacy. If it features a training antagonist that doesn't appear in the original story, then we've created a throwaway character. That can work, but then the story really has to deliver. Already, we can see how just this one issue alone has so much under its umbrella that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as writers. Let's talk about another issue, and that's necessity. Why does this story have to exist? This is a case of understanding the original story well enough that you can add to the legacy and lore without tarnishing it. So often we see modern prequels screwing up this rule so bad primarily because they didn't fundamentally understand why the original story was great. Take Wonka, for example. The original movie isn't called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, it's called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Saying that the bizarre, enigmatic owner of the chocolate factory is the main character of anything misses the point of the story. Wonka and his factory served as a sort of god machine in the original story, punishing Charlie's fellow children for their sins of gluttony, selfishness, and so on. Charlie's journey was the final test, one of his character. Do we need to know how Willy Wonka was a poverty-stricken street rat that also made the most delicious chocolate ever and slapped some whimsical names on it? No. Do we need to see how he broke ground on what would become his chocolate factory? Also no. Does this add anything to the story of the original? Big fat no. And finally, is this story good enough to watch side by side with the original? Not a single chance. This movie sucked. So we come back to the question, why does this movie have any necessity to exist? None, and that's why it was largely a failure. That takes us to the next point, and a most difficult litmus test. Seamlessness. Can I watch or read this prequel before I see the original story, and will they stand side by side well enough with each other? I was lucky enough to be born in a time when I couldn't see Star Wars in episode order. I saw the original trilogy when I was very young, and numerous times after. The prequels came out when I was already an adult. I remember seeing every single one of them in theaters. My biggest takeaway from those films was that they were incredibly boring, and the lightsaber duels at the end of the first and second ones were the only thing that saved it. In all honesty, most of the events of the first two films could have been summarized, and the third could have stood as a one-shot prequel about Anakin's turn to the dark side. If I had to watch all 6 movies in a row, and the story only started getting good at episode 4, I would never have made it that far. That's a real problem. Continuing to use this film as an example for a second here, let's put it against the previous 2 issues. Stakes are completely non-existent. As we know, Luke's mother was dead, Anakin turned to the dark side, Obi-Wan and Yoda survive, and the Emperor takes supreme rule over the Senate. We have 3 entire films where we know the fate of almost every single character and storyline. What about necessity? Well, is Anakin's fall to the dark side as equally compelling or necessary as Luke rising up to become a Jedi? I mean, maybe if it was handled better. But for the films that we got, absolutely no. Anakin is whiny, petulant, and impulsive. Even in the final film, it seemed like he was still in training, despite being referred to as a great warrior in Episode 4. To give him a semblance of logic for his fall, he sought power because of a premonition that his wife would die, so he killed every Jedi and even some children, and then almost killed his wife for not thanking him for it, and then she spontaneously dies from sadness anyway. This story didn't know if it wanted to be an origin of evil or a tale of sympathy for the devil, so it tried to be both and succeeded at neither. So, no, I would say if this is the story that we got, then it wasn't needed. That begs the question, though, what does a great prequel look like? What does it need to stand side by side with the original story? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the answer is what helps us write our own prequels. Let's take a look at a prequel that is so completely integrated into the lore of the character that most people don't even realize it's a prequel at all. I'm talking about Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It may be a surprise, but Temple is set 1 year before the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, while that does mean that the stakes for Indiana Jones aren't there, the writers did something truly great. For this prequel, they went with a completely new cast. Indy is in a foreign country with a different sidekick, a different female co-star, and a totally new antagonist. While Indy's life may have no stakes on it, everyone else in the story is fair game. How about necessity? Well, this did build on Indy's lore, and we got to experience a whole new adventure. And what about seamlessness? Well, Temple isn't my favorite Indiana Jones movie, but if I had to watch this one first, then Raiders, then Last Crusade, I would be watching a film series that keeps getting better with every chapter. We just pretend it ended there, because then comes the god-awful cash grabs after that. But why is Temple of Doom often cited as one of the best prequels ever made? So, starting from this example, let's talk about what a good prequel has going for it, rather than the litmus tests it needs to meet. The first is a great new story. This one should seem obvious, but if we go back to the Wonka example, even that seems to get forgotten. Like I mentioned, Temple of Doom is a completely new indie adventure in a new, different, and exotic locale. His friends and allies are totally different, and his antagonist is part of a different culture after a completely different kind of artifact. So, it's a fresh and original story, not only avoiding piggybacking off the first film, but even daring to be a prequel that came before that story. Does it live up to Raiders of the Lost Ark? No, but that's partly because Raiders is so uncommonly exceptional that nothing was going to live up to it. Can it stand beside that story? Sure, as a welcome addition to the lore and a good story on its own. Let's look at another example and see what it's doing for us. Casino Royale is considered one of James Bond's best films, despite being an origin prequel that came out a full 44 years after the first James Bond movie. Once again, it's a great story, but it also did something very interesting for us to study. James Bond movies had become plagued with gadgets and technology that bordered on the magical, and its villains had become mustache-twirling cartoons. Casino Royale stripped Bond down to the bare essentials and asked who this guy is. As it turns out, he's a haunted, dark, and vicious figure. He's the kind of agent you only have around for the dirtiest jobs that you need done in the darkness. So, not only was this prequel a course correction for the series, but it put the main character under a microscope to see who he truly was. Thanks to some incredible writing and a killer acting performance by Daniel Craig, James Bond suddenly had depth he'd been missing for so long. He can't find peace in his own life, which allows him to be this ruthless monster when king and country need him. Adding depth is another way that a prequel can be successful, either by fleshing out our main character or their relationships with underexplored side characters. Now, I did say I was going to toot my own horn a little bit, but I think there's a lesson here as well. When I wrote Cora Blake Arcane Agent, I was working on Book 6 of the Dragon's Dream saga. At this point, main character Cora Blake is not only established, but we're 3/4 of the way through the main arc of the series. I wrote it because, on the business side of writing, it's what's called a reader magnet. It's a book that you give away to prospective readers, usually for a sign-up to your mailing list. What I decided was to make a story that was a prequel to the Dragon's Dream saga, but I faced all the same problems that we've discussed. When I had an idea for a good story, I next had to tackle what the necessity was. Well, Without spoiling too much about the first book, main character Cora Blake was recruited by the NSA for her magical abilities. I wanted to explore what those early days looked like before everything goes to hell in the first book. So I came up with this awesome idea for her first mission. Avoiding the Star Wars problem, the story is a novella. It's only 25,000 words. The story was only as long as it needed to be to tell this one story I thought was interesting and ties directly to the main story. Because I was still writing the series, I was also able to integrate the events of this prequel into the main story later on and reference it. Doing something like this allows us to reduce the feeling of the prequel being tacked on to the main story, and instead becomes a part of it. So we're checking all the right boxes, right? Well, I'll let you be the judge. This is one of the few times that I can actually offer concrete examples of what I'm talking about. You can join my newsletter anytime, and you'll always get a free copy of Cora Blake Arcane Agent, a prequel to what is currently my most popular series. Shameless plugs aside, if there is one takeaway from this video, it's that we have a proven history in film of what does and doesn't work with prequels. When we look at Star Wars episodes 1 through 3, or Wonka, or X-Men Origins Wolverine, we see slow, unnecessary, poorly written stories that come off like cash grabs, only making their money by banking on the popularity of their name. When we look at films like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Casino Royale, or X-Men First Class, we see original, well-thought-out prequels that bring lore that feels necessary. It's icing on the cake. We already love this, now we love it more. It adds depth, it adds lore, it adds value for our existing stories. Whether you're writing your own prequel, or just trying to understand why Hollywood screws this up so much, that's your answer right there. It is a sad but hopeful time to be the master of Kung Fu and friendship. While my cynicism toward modern Hollywood keeps me pessimistic about reboots of the great movies I've loved before, I give everyone a chance. Some lose me in the premise, some lose me in the trailers, and some lose me walking out of the theater. Out of everything we've discussed today, I think it still comes down to storytelling, which is why we're here, right? A good story can let you get away with a lot of creative liberties. Don't forget to check out my website. The link is in the description below. You'll also find the link to my newsletter in the comments where you can get a free book, read about all of my latest projects, and find other indie authors for your next great read. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, have fun and get crafting.